I am the Canon for Wellness and Care, but I want to be straightforward about that. It's kind of a euphemistic title. The wellness mainly has to do with integrity in ministry and mission. So I oversee programs to safeguard our communities from sexual misconduct and other misconduct. I also have a role in clergy discipline, as well as several other duties as a bishop may from time to time assign. I am not a fitness guru or any sort of a wellness expert. My qualifications for this role come mainly from just life experiences. I'm the daughter of an Episcopal priest. I am a lawyer, former attorney, practiced for a few years when I was a child. Then I've been a stay-at-home mother. I have been a school administrator, parish day school administrator and kindergarten teacher, and a parish priest who led a congregation through a time of personal and communal loss with the Bastrop wildfires. So just ordinary and extraordinary life experiences that many of us have had. So let's see if I can remember what I'm supposed to do here. Nope. How do I change my, I see. Okay. So where I want to begin, because this is directed toward clergy, is the persistent myth that self-care is selfish, that we are supposed to be professional Christians who are on the hook to demonstrate sacrificial love. But self-care is not selfish. It's not only a myth, but it's a dangerous myth, and it can be a self-serving one. We can use that as an excuse for not taking care of aspects of our wellness that we know need attention. So self-care enables us to bring our whole and best selves to the work that God is calling us to do. It's not about me becoming the best possible me for my own sake. It's really for the sake of God and for the people we serve. It's a way of caring for our families because they suffer along with us when we don't tend to ourselves. As a child of a priest, I can remember consistently, we'd sit down to dinner, the phone would ring, and my mother would just be so annoyed at my father jumping up to answer it. You know, I can hear it, Carl. And it wouldn't be an emergency, it would just be the convenient time for someone to bother us at dinner every night. In addition, self-care is one of the best vaccines against burnout that we know about. And it's a real problem in clergy. It was a particular problem during the last few years with the pandemic. I think it was, there was a study that showed, the Barna Group did a study in 21 that said 48% of clergy had thought about leaving full-time ministry. And you know that was because of the pressures of the pandemic. Self-care also just sets a healthy example for our lay leaders. Accepting a role in ministry should not feel like a life sentence or a way of abandoning one's family. So when we show that we are caring for ourselves, it gives permission to the people in our congregations to do the same. And then as the canon for mission integrity, I would tell you that it protects our ministries and those to whom we minister. Often when clergy get in trouble with sexual misconduct or other forms of misconduct, they have a history when you look back and start investigating that they were not tending to their own relationships or other aspects of their wellness. There is a quotation that I read once that I have always remembered. The starving shepherd may end up devouring the sheep. Hard to forget that one once you've heard it. So what about sacrificial love? We all know that the role of clergy is not a 9-to-5 job. There are times we have to put aside our own desires and needs for the sake of others. But most often, I believe the self that we are called to sacrifice may be the illusion that we alone are responsible for saving the day. One thing that we find in clergy who have burned out is they have taken on too much. They have not believed that anyone could do it but themselves sometimes. And so I just think of this as a good image for that. God is God and we are not. And that is one of the first lessons we need to learn. Often our sense that we have to be the ones always putting ourselves forth is just hubris disguised as martyrdom. Is this on? All right. So we know that balancing our vocations with our personal wellness can be difficult. Whoops. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So we have external pressures that can affect our wellness, our ability to make this balance. And then we have internal pressures. So if we were with a group of people, I would be asking for examples. But as we are mostly on Zoom, I'm going to go ahead and just put up some of the ways that things beyond our control can affect our this balance. So we just have a difficult workload. That's just the truth for the most clergy. We are not, we have jobs that require a lot of different skills and a lot of time. So that's just the reality of it. And of course, there are pastoral emergencies that we really do have to put everything aside. But on a more commonplace level, we have to accommodate the schedules of our volunteers. So that means a lot of evening meetings. They're not available to meet when it might be convenient for us at 10 in the morning. In a lot of situations, we're subject to others above us in a hierarchy. There may be a staff on a large congregation. It may be like I have bishops above me, and it can be difficult to schedule time off that doesn't interfere with someone else's schedule. I have to admit that as a young priest, I had a moment of unholy satisfaction with a woman who had come and talked to us as young clergy about the importance of setting aside our Sabbath day and holding to it. And I was in a committee meeting and she was on the committee, and the meeting was suggested it would be at Friday, and it was on her during her Sabbath time. And she said that wouldn't work for her Sabbath time. And then the bishop said, but that was what he needed. And sure enough, she met on Friday with the bishop. I mean, and that's the way it works. We just have to be realistic and find other ways to find our time off. And then sometimes the system itself is just dysfunctional. We might work under people who are unreasonable in their demands. It might be there are isms involved, racism that places additional pressure on individuals. For some, it's women are still accepted only marginally as clergy in some parts of the church. And all those things make it more challenging to achieve wellness. And then we have families and their needs and obligations and emergencies. Our day off may be completely devoted to our son's soccer tournament, and we don't have the time we thought we were going to have to ourselves. Or there's health issues in our families that we have to deal with. And then sometimes part of the challenge is simply the compensation structure that we're working under that may create financial pressures. And in addition to all this, there are internal pressures. We may have unreasonable expectations of ourselves. We could be a perfectionist. We can expect that we're going to be an expert generalist. We're going to be very good at everything we're called to do. Or there's other self-defeating habits of being, like I think of. We might just be procrastinators. We're not well organized, things we need to work on ourselves. I'm one to create my own whirlwinds. No matter what assignment you give me, I'm going to make it difficult. It's just the way I am. It meant I was an excellent student and achieved great things, but I'm also never feel satisfied because there's always more that could be done. I don't pause to celebrate one thing before I move on to the next. So you know yourself, I hope. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But I know that I have things about me that I need to work on that no one can do except me. And then we may just have difficult individual responses to stress or conflict. Genetically, I am a homozygous warrior. I was just born that way. And there's not much I can do about that except know it and plan for it. So what I've done, I did a lot of research for a project at the request of my bishop for putting together resources about self-care and pastoral care during the pandemic. So I did a lot of research on wellness. And one of the things I did was speak with the Reverend Dr. Dave Scheider, who is a licensed therapist. He is a licensed family and marriage counselor. He was 25 years with the military as a chaplain. What else? He has more. And he was a director of the Seminary of the Southwest, Louise Henderson Wessendorf Center for Christian Ministry and Vocations. and a lecturer in counseling, chaplaincy, and spirituality. He is now retired, but in all these years, particularly with military families, he came up with some strategies for wellness, for self-care in particular. And he worked with me to come up with kind of a shorthand way of presenting this to our clergy. So I think his strategies are as good a starting point as any. So Dave says, and where I have quotations like this, they're all from Dave unless it says otherwise. Each person requires a unique balance of these different strategies, depending on particular circumstances, on which areas come more naturally or pose challenges consistently. So he has 6 things that he has said: spiritual care, physical care, mental, emotional, something he calls the ratio of positive to negative, and finally, systematic wellness, which is just another word for good boundaries. So we're going to take these one by one and talk a little bit about some of the challenges that the pandemic increased for us in these areas. So Dave's quotation about recognizing what particular challenges you may have, what comes natural to you, what you need, that presents me with my first strategy before Dave's is we have to know ourselves. So that's an ancient bit of advice, to know thyself. And there's lots of modern and not so modern ways of helping us if we need a little help to know who we are, what pushes our buttons, what are the signs of stress in our bodies and in our behavior that tell us we are out of balance and need to pay attention to something. We have to realize about ourselves when we're out of control, how do we cope? For some people, they compensate with micromanagement and angry outbursts at the slightest derailment. For others, they disengage and just surrender and they become helpless in a situation. So the advice is to find someone or someone that will help us to know ourselves so that we can recognize or even anticipate signs that we need rebalancing, and then figure out how to make some changes. So these are just a few methods. The Enneagram, which has actually been around for a very long time, used to be used by clergy to help people spiritually. There's the Berkman method. There's, of course, Myers-Briggs, the Kersey temperament disorder, meditation. Find something that helps you observe yourself in a way that is objective and helpful. Some of these, like the Enneagram and the Berkman, I find particularly helpful because they tell you how you're going to behave under stress, and you begin to recognize that pretty early on. So here again, are the 6 strategies that we're going to go through. So the first one is spiritual care. We should engage in whatever practice gets us to the point where we feel loved by God and can pray from our most honest emotions. I really love this quotation from Dave because it's so caring for the clergy. This isn't about some correct practice. It's about really caring for ourselves so that we can be honest with God. And we can't be honest with God until we're honest with ourselves. So there are, again, lots of different ways. In the Episcopal Church, there is an old tradition of praying the daily office based on the monastic offices. And it takes you through scripture through the course of a year or 3-year cycle, and there's prayers, and that works beautifully for some, but for some, it's just a chore. So it's not achieving what the goal is. So there are other ways. There is Lectio Divina, there's centering prayer, Bible study, Ignatian imaginative prayer, being in nature, meditation, whatever it takes to get you in this, to what ushers you into an intimate time in which you can hear God say that you are beloved. So the pandemic really messed this up for a lot of clergy. What had been working probably wasn't working anymore because of the changes in schedule, working from home, not being in communal worship. In the Episcopal Church, Eucharist is extremely important, and the Eucharist wasn't available to us for a long time. It's not the same being on Zoom with people. Then it's not the same as sitting next to them and feeling them breathe and singing together. Lots of things were lost. It was also difficult because a lot more self-discipline is required from the outside. An hour of prayer and an hour of daydreaming look the same if no one's paying close attention. And our spiritual practices may have been tied up with presiding or with preparing a sermon to be delivered in person every week. And those rhythms got changed. We may have had demands of children around us, so very little opportunity to be quiet or still. And then on a deeper level, we may have experienced a spiritual crisis because the advice we were giving others to pray and trust God maybe wasn't providing much comfort to us when we were finding ourselves in difficult circumstances. On the other hand, a good thing of the pandemic is some of us had more time for spiritual disciplines. You could really get into a rhythm without a long commute every morning. The next strategy for Dr. Scheider is physical care. We are embodied spirits. We each must have our own way of caring for our bodies when stressed. So this could be a very long list. And this one, frankly, is why clergy are not usually anxious to go to anything having to do with wellness. They think they're going to have someone shake a finger at them for how much weight they put on during the pandemic. But this really involves a lot more than that. First on the list for Dave is aerobic exercise. We need aerobic exercise to build resilience so we're ready for stressful times. It's hugely important to our ability to manage stress. Our nervous system gets aroused when we feel under threat, and those chemicals like adrenaline and cortisol need to be burned off through exercise. And if they aren't, then it can lead to anxiety, can lead to depression, headaches, memory and concentration problems, sleeplessness, and it even affects our ability to lose weight and makes it easier to gain weight. So very, very important. Whoops, forgot I had those. And then diet. So diet is more than, yes, weight's a part of it, but diet is putting chemicals in our body, and they affect the way we feel and think. They affect how clearly we think, they affect how much energy we have, and then it's our mood. But in addition to that, sometimes there's real medical issues that we need to pay attention to that we're ignoring that are being revealed to us through our diet. There could be food allergies, autoimmune responses to inflammatory foods, gluten intolerance, IBS, all kinds of medical issues that really, when these things surface, we need to seek professional advice, and it can affect our health on a lot of levels. And then, of course, there is weight. There was a study done by Duke that I have listed for us at the end of this called the Clergy Health Initiative, looking at Methodist clergy in North Carolina. And it showed that overall well-being of clergy is pretty good, except that we tend to be, let's see, what was 40, they were more obese. Clergy were, in North Carolina, this is before COVID, 42% were obese compared to 29% of other professions. I suspect both of those statistics have gone up, but that was the one area in which clergy were not doing as well as some other professions. And we all know the health issues associated with excess weight, cardiovascular among them. And I know I'm going to a wellness program held by our pension fund called Credo. And I know from the last time I went, which was shortly after ordination, when they talked about weight, they really stressed, don't worry about being an ideal weight. Just recognize that even losing 10% of your weight has huge benefits health-wise. So we can set goals on a much lower level than some ideal image. Sleep. Sleep is enormously important. I'm not real good at sleep. I had a good night's sleep last night. I'm very grateful. And Dave would say, if you're having long-term sleep issues, you really need to seek the help of a doctor, because a lot of things can be the cause of it, including your gut flora. You just don't know what's the cause of it. We all know the pandemic really messed with people's sleep, just like it messed with eating habits. A lot of stress, a lot of anxiety. And one of the big problems when you're not sleeping is we start self-medicating. And I remember, I don't know, it seemed like I couldn't open a magazine without someone saying, yes, that glass of wine might help you fall asleep, but you're going to be awake 2 hours later processing the sugar. And a lot of people made that discovery for themselves. So just in general, for our physical care, we have to beware of alcohol and other numbing behaviors. Again, COVID did not do us favors on this. People who were already struggling with addiction issues were isolated, found it more difficult. We finally wised up and started a clergy-only, a 12-step group that met on Zoom, which was just very important to the members of the clergy who are in recovery, to have that space reserved for clergy to work through their issues and to be companions for each other during that period of isolation. There were some pros to physical care during the pandemic. I think some people weren't going out as often, and so they were learning to cook and eat more healthily at home. There was more time to exercise because not traveling and not those evening meetings that kept us out late. Less partying in general because there wasn't much socializing going on. So there were some pros as well. Well, I don't know what happened here, but so mental care. And Dave says we need achievable goals and a sense of value and meaning in what we are doing. So there's some really interesting work here. This is where his work as a military chaplain really came into play. There was a study done on military families during World War II and Vietnam. And what happened was they looked at the most stressed out families who were dealing with war, with loved ones deployed. And they found that the old model of matching stress with resources was not working. They discovered that resilient families could actually live with fewer resources and adapt better to stress if they had a sense of meaning to what they were asked to do. The key to meaning was that they were able to see not just the value of what they were asked to do, but whether they had some power, some locus of control. So in other words, for things to be okay, they didn't have to depend on something outside of their control to rescue them. So if you want to handle loads of stress, you need to discover both a positive meaning in the situation and what it is that you have control over. If you focus in that place, then you won't feel like a victim to your circumstances. And I thought this was really interesting because there are studies done by Duke and by other universities that show that clergy resilience and clergy resilience and mental health is correlated with knowing one's purpose in life, working toward cherished goals, and making a difference. Clergy who were thriving felt their work was meaningful. Studies by Notre Dame show that people thrive when they are able to invest their very best capabilities and their best and fullest self into purposeful activities and tasks that arise from and are deeply connected with their core values and beliefs. So I think as clergy, we have a leg up on this one, right? We should be able to find our work to be very meaningful, hold on to our original sense of call. But we all know that can be difficult at times. And so I love this story that John Gerard put in print a long time ago on the stonemasons and cathedral building. If you've heard it, forgive me, but I find it useful. So a traveler 800 years ago happened upon a group of workers in Salisbury working along the River Avon. He stopped to ask one of the tradesmen what he was doing. The man continued his work and grumbled, "I'm cutting stones." The traveler moved toward a second mason and repeated the question. The man stopped his work to say he was a stone cutter and had come from the north to work, but as soon as he earned 10 quid, he was heading home. The traveler thanked the second mason, wished him a safe journey home, and headed to a third mason. When he asked the same question, the worker paused, glanced at the traveler until they made eye contact, and then looked skyward, drawing the traveler's eyes upward. The third mason replied, I am a stonemason, and I am building a cathedral to the glory of God. I remember telling this story to a vestry when I first became the rector of a parish, and it had a difficult situation with the former rector. And when I read this story as a meditation before we began our meeting, one of the men actually burst into tears because it was the first time he felt that his work on a vestry as a lay board of a church had a meaning beyond getting through the business of the day. It can be very important to remind people of how meaningful their work is. It's important that we care for ourselves mentally by focusing on achievable goals and by framing our work in a way that acknowledges its value. We need to believe that the Holy Spirit is at work in us, shaping the church, shaping us to build the church the world needs today, not just bailing out a sinking ship, as it's sometimes put in the press. So I just want to make a mental note here that we don't do ourselves any favors when we surround ourselves completely with snarky colleagues. And I have a strong snark tendency myself. I realized I couldn't sit next to my liturgy professor during worship because we started making comments to each other instead of surrendering to the moment. So I tell this to young clergy that yes, it's fun to joke around with your friends, but you need to have people around you who are going to look you in the eye and say, God is very grateful that you have chosen to accept his call to do this work. It's just very important in the long term for us. So I think this having a sense of control during pandemic was particularly difficult for clergy. The rules kept changing. We were suddenly having to learn technical skills that we did not have, how to stream, how to Zoom, how to change up everything we thought we knew about worship. And then just, we never knew what the rules were going to be the next week. Very difficult. I think we had to surrender emotionally over and over again to lost expectations, lost goals, very difficult. And for some, just connecting through a screen was a very difficult thing to achieve any sense of meaning. So let me kind of shorthanded here. All right. So emotional care. We need to identify and own our feelings before we can deal with them. I think that's really important. I know as clergy, we can often be so focused on other people, we are not paying enough attention to ourselves. One of the things that Dave recommends is to have a support team. And this can include a variety of people, but he suggests spiritual director, a counselor you can turn to. For him, he suggested a confessor, of course, friends, and our own families. We need, ideally, we build this support team in before we are in a stressful situation. It's not always possible, but we need social affirmation, and we need friendship, we need confidants, and we need people who are going to be honest with us about our own behaviors and the emotions that they're seeing and receiving from us. So it's important that we tend our relationships and think about who we can turn to when we need this sort of affirmation. So Dave suggests, in terms of recognizing emotions, just use the basics. We've all seen charts with 40 emotions I didn't know existed that you can pick from, but he would say, just stay with the basics, check in with ourselves, and write them down. He says it's important then well, I will say it's important to resist the temptation to deny our feelings. I know I went through this during the wildfires. I had people who didn't lose their homes coming to me and saying, I feel so guilty. I didn't really lose anything. And I'm looking around and you're all living in an ashtray with the forest gone and your sense of security gone. And it was over and over again, I have found myself saying to them, or those who had huge smoke damage and rotten food in their refrigerators, afraid to say they were sad about that because they didn't lose their house. Or those of us who lost our homes but had insurance, didn't feel like we could be sad about losing our homes because we knew we had insurance. And over again, I would have to tell them that loss is not a competitive sport. We all suffer loss. We have to acknowledge it. It's not saying that all losses are equal, but they all matter. And we have to be willing to acknowledge them and not feel guilty over what we are feeling. It certainly happened during the pandemic. How many times did I hear people say, you know, I haven't lost a family member. Well, that's wonderful. I'm so glad you haven't lost a family member, but you still lost. And of course, some people lost huge losses during the pandemic, but it seems even with huge losses, family members, they can always think of someone who's been through more, and always take them back to that place of acknowledging their loss, recognizing it so that they can deal with it. And then we need to communicate our feelings to our spouses and confidants and ask for what we need. Otherwise, they're going to take it personally that we're in these moods, and it can really mess with our relationships. Of course, if we're tending our relationships, we're going to ask for what they need and what are they feeling as well. But in terms of self-care, we need to involve others in our emotional states. Of course, the pandemic, right? We had lots of emotions to own while we were supposed to be providing comfort and support to others. And our access to friends and family were limited. Just a very complicated time for clergy. So this is an interesting one, and it's the ratio of negative to positive. Our relationship with life benefits when we build up lots of good encounters with life for every negative. So Dave was a marriage counselor, a family and marriage therapist. So I've got there a picture of what happens when we don't have a high ratio of positive to negative. What happens is, in couples research, it showed that healthy couples had 5 times more positive interactions than negative. If the ratio dipped, then they drifted into negative sentiment overrides, where they began to interpret even good things in the relationship negatively. So by analogy, Dave says, our relationship to life benefits when we build up lots of good encounters for every negative. Get out in nature, spend time with hobbies or friends, find out what gives us joy and fills us up rather than depletes us. What takes us out of ourselves? All right, here we go. So he recommends we practice gratitude to help identify the positive. If you're not even noticing what's going well, you're going to have a hard time building up this ratio. But we have to plan for activities that replenish us, especially in times of crisis, loss, and anxiety. We need to build up this ratio so that we can carry through and be effective in our ministry in times of crisis, loss, and anxiety. And that's just the times where we particularly forget to calendar any time for ourselves and our family. We need these emotional reserves. So Dave says it's a good time to point out to yourself and your spouse that you need that new sports car, right? It's for everybody else's benefit, not your own. But fun is serious business, says Dave. So we all know how the pandemic messed with this. There were fewer opportunities, right, to be with friends or do the sorts of things. And there was a lot more exposure to crisis, to death, and to anger. So the last one he talks about, which is really important in my role with clergy discipline and also lay misbehavior in the churches. Having good boundaries is key to good ministry always. And he calls this systemic wellness. Now, this isn't from Dave, this is from me, but I tell this to clergy. It's really important for us to set healthy boundaries on our availability. I talked about the shepherd devouring the sheep. Well, our vocations can cheerfully devour us as well if we aren't setting limits. So it's especially the best time is when you start a new ministry before anyone can take it personally, right? Just say how you like them to communicate with you when it's not an emergency. how you want them to communicate with you when it is an emergency. Some people say, you know, really, I'd prefer you to email or text me, but if it's an emergency, pick up the phone and call. You can not return a call that's not an emergency just immediately. You cannot return it to a person who's texting you too often. Worst thing you can do is encourage it by responding as soon as they text you. So there's strategies for that. We know we have to have evening meetings, but we might say all our evening meetings are going to be 2 evenings of the week, maximum 3, and stick to that. And then, of course, trying to preserve our Sabbath day, taking our vacations, sabbaticals when that's an opportunity, etc. And then again, back to know yourself. No signs of fatigue and stress in your bodies. No sign, you know, pay attention to your substance use and when it has turned into abuse. Beware when you are rationalizing exceptions to the rules. That's not a good sign, and only you know when you're doing it, but you do know when you're doing it. So pay attention. What happens if you're fatigued and you know you shouldn't answer that phone and you answered that phone? You're probably going to cross a boundary, either in your anger or in some other way. Of course, it's really important as clergy that we always remember that we have a very particular role. Part of the reason Episcopal clergy wear this collar is to remind us of that. And one of the signs that a member of the clergy may be in trouble is when you discover somehow there's a reluctance to put that collar on and not be seen as just like everybody else. There are limits on the kind of relationships we can have in ministry. We can be friendly with our parishioners, but we cannot be best friends with them. We can't use them to work out our stuff. We have to know these limits. So it's really important, I think, that we have colleague groups that can hold us accountable, who understand the role of clergy. And we can have them all within our denomination, or we can get together with other clergy from other denominations. Anyone in that role who understands that peculiarity of that role, can help hold us accountable to the boundaries that we have to keep. So there is an experiment called the Shaky Bridge experiment. Maybe you've heard about it, but there was an experiment that was done where they placed a person of the opposite sex at the far end of the bridge, and it was a shaky bridge. And the person who was crossing that bridge, they had ways of testing this, found the person at the other end much more romantically attractive than when they were crossing a secure bridge and the same person was standing at the end of it. And they concluded from this, through careful study, that someone who is looking for your support when afraid or anxious is more likely to find you romantically attractive, oh, excuse me, I didn't get that, than when they are not afraid or anxious. And conversely, when we are in crisis, we're likely to find an adoring, congruent, or stable colleague more romantically attractive than when we are not in crisis. So COVID created crisis on both ends. And so particularly shaky bridges for everybody, very difficult. So this is just beware a shaky bridge has just become a good shorthand for me to tell clergy. So again, that's the 6 strategies of Dave Scheider. Not the only care advice you can find out there. There are lots of studies that have been done. I put together a whole bunch of self-care resources at the beginning of the pandemic, but this one I found was concise and particularly geared toward clergy. There is a great resource that you may or may not be familiar with. It is called the Living Compass Spirituality and Wellness Initiative. It was begun by the Reverend Scott Stoner, who was also a counselor, Episcopal priest, and a licensed therapist, family counselor. And it is run by the Samaritan Family Wellness Foundation, which provides generous resources so that almost all of their programs and all can be offered free. So it's a wonderful low-cost resource, free downloads of materials. They have free online training now to help you use the materials. They divide wellness into heart, soul, mind, and strength. So they cover relationships and emotions, spirituality, rest and play, care for the body and resilience, and then vocation and organization skills. They have topical wellness resources that can be used. One of the tools that they really push are wellness circles, where you meet with others to hold yourself accountable for 6 weeks to move from an intention to make a change to actually making a change. So again, just a wonderful resource. And Scott Stoner is one of the genuinely good human beings you'll ever meet. So I encourage you to make use of that. And then just a few more. There's a tip sheet put out by the Humanitarian Disaster Institute. I actually have some with me if you'd like a copy, on preventing and recognizing burnout in yourself, and it's designed toward clergy. There is a chart you can find online easily called Approaching Clergy Health Holistically, and it talks about, let me see, I have it written down here because it's a little tricky to say. Well, I don't have it written down. It divides things from what's you can control and what's not in your control, and then different levels of personal, interpersonal, organizational, et cetera. So really helpful, I think, especially if you're in leadership and can affect wellness strategies for people under you. And then there is the Flourishing in Ministry Project from 2013, Notre Dame, which goes into length about clergy wellness, the Duke Clergy Health Initiative from 2014, and then a 2017 study by the Barna Group, the State of Pastors, and they've recently just done a 2021 group as well. So all these resources are available online. I'm happy to send anyone any links if they need to have that. And that really is all I have. If anyone has any questions or would like any of the being pointed to these resources, I'm happy to provide that.